Yeah. So
Take it and go.
all right. Well, Carol, thanks. First of all, Carol, thank you. You always do such a great job kind of rounding everybody up to do these events or these ATAs, and certainly we've had some great regional and national speakers. So I'm kind of the second string, but I'll do my best to try to move it along, and hopefully we can get some dialogue going. So this is supposed to be a contact sport. We want to get input. I'm going to purposefully kind of be present some things that maybe have some different opinions. I think dissent is the greatest opportunity for growth. So this is not just my opinion, it's everybody's opinion. So we want to share thoughts and hear what's worked and hear what hasn't worked, poke holes and do what have you. So let's just get right into it. That said, anybody can say anything they want. I mean, if you think, hey, that's a bad idea, or I disagree with that, or I have a different way of thinking through that, let's hear it because it's helpful.
Put it in the chat. If you have something to say, go ahead and put it in the chat and I'll watch the chat and kind of poke Tom. So
that's great, Carol. I appreciate that but we want dialogue. We want it to be interactive. So we've done these on first right of refusal and escalation clauses before, but it seems like it really helps to kind of revisit this because every year it's a little bit different. Every market's a little bit different, and it's important to have the conversation. I'm sorry, I got a little off kilter there because it's got me as the co-host, which I've never done, and so people trying to get in, they pop up, and I don't know what the hell that means. So
don't worry about it. I got it.
So at any rate, so we're going to talk about the first right of refusal. We're going to talk about escalation clauses, and then we're going to talk about best practices as it relates to buyers and sellers, because I feel like that's really important. I get a lot of questions on that. We have a lot of dialogue about that. But just to get right into it, so the first right of refusal and escalation clauses, they have some similar components that bind those two from the standpoint of conceptual binding. And that's being comprehensive, anticipating all outcomes, being specific, stay in constant communication, and gather documentation. So it's really important to think about when we're drafting documents and we're drafting addendums about what could occur. What's the best case, worst case? We kind of have to, it's kind of like playing chess, right? We got to get 2 or 3 steps ahead of the game. And so when we write purchase agreements, it's natural for us to just think about what the present is, the general tenet of what we're trying to do. So let's talk about that from the perspective of the first right of refusal, Leslie, to get started here. First right of refusal is, I've always said, the definition of the first right of refusal is a contractual right that gives its holder the option to enter a business transaction with the owner of something, according to specified terms, before the owner is entitled to enter into that transaction with a third party. So the thing to remember about a first right of refusal, or the language of a first right of refusal or first right to purchase, is that it's not just about, specifically about, writing that, oh, well, they're going to have a 24-hour first right of refusal and then our work is done. That actually causes more angst and problems than it creates solutions. A first right of refusal or first right to purchase is not like time is of the essence, where it has a fundamental definition. First right of refusal simply is the starting point. And until you define those terms on a first right of refusal, you haven't really done anything to demonstrate some sort of contractual obligation between the parties. So this, I'm not going to go through and read each item on this, but the case study that I wrote up one time when I was doing a property a couple of years ago in Dillon's Fair Acres we were getting an offer from a party. It was a flip that a builder had done, and I was representing the builder on this flip. And these people had a property at the riverfront. And, the riverfront, as many of you know, not necessarily the easiest sell, right? So it wasn't like, oh, this house is $200,000 in Dundee, it's going to, or West Omaha, it's going to sell in 10 seconds. It wasn't that at all. It was like, God, this thing is not going to sell. But we were struggling to get an offer on this ranch. So I was like, maybe we work with it, but let's kind of put a tight leash on them. So that's why I thought it was a good case study. So basically, on the first right of refusal, what I usually do is I try to make sure that we try to get the best terms we possibly can, and we don't wait and try to have the contract kind of start once they get a contract on their house. So for instance, I try to get the inspection to occur right away. So they don't, none of this, oh, we're not going to do the inspection period doesn't begin until they're under contract. We want the purchaser to have skin in the game. The other thing that's critically important is once you've signed the contract, from the standpoint of the you know, what obligations does that entail? Well, then what I've always said is I try to get the buyer on the hook once they've entered under contract on their existing property. So once that property is under contract, so in this particular instance, it would have been the riverfront condo when their property was under contract versus the property that they were buying, which was this flip in Dillon's Fair Acres. Once their property was quote unquote under contract, then certain obligations have to be met. And so, for example, if that property would fall out of contract, okay, then their earnest deposit would be non-refundable from the terms of this. So we're trying to mitigate some of the seller's exposure on this. The other thing is that they have to have the property on the market and, you know, during that whole time continuously throughout that process, and we dictate how quickly they have to get it on the market. Okay, so those are two important factors. The other thing is that if that property at 737 Riverfront Drive in this particular instance, if it's not under contract by date certain, then we know we're not going to potentially meet our closing date for that 6617 Glenwood Road, which is the ranch. Then the seller has the right to cancel the contract. In addition to that, if the property doesn't close on Glenwood Road by date certain, then the seller has the opportunity to cancel as well. And in that circumstance, the earnest deposit would be returned to the purchaser, but we could move on and not have to have a contract pending in the MLS. It would be open to the market. So I've kind of gone through these things quickly, but I want you to know that this is in dotloop. It's in it's in the intranet, I think. Is that correct, Leslie? It's in the intranet. It's not necessary. It is in dotloop as well. Is that correct?
It might be in dotloop, but it might be kind of in a weird spot. So definitely reference the intranet for it, and I'll add the multiple offers document.
And the real key that I want everybody to remember about this is, don't just take 24-hour first right of refusal language as gospel and think about the definition of that. It's only defined from the terminology that's used to support the concept. First right of refusal is a concept. That term in and of itself does not define anything until it is ultimately defined by the supporting terminology. So I've had people say, oh, well, it's first right of refusal. It's just, that's what it is. Well, what happens if the other property, you know, falls out of contract? When are they obligated for the earnest deposit to be non-refundable? When does the inspection have to take place? All these fundamental terms to the contract need to be defined in order for you to protect your seller. Okay, so that's that. So let's we've kind of buzzed through that. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions on that? Is there anything in the chat, Carol? Anybody have a different opinion?
No, there's not. And so if you're going to ask a question, please, for some reason I'm getting this echo feedback.
Because it's saying me.
Okay.
Unmute yourself.
All right, so let's, so you want to go to the next slide, Leslie? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think really I'm going to insert my opinion here.
Yeah.
I think really the biggest takeaway from first right of refusals, like Tom was saying, is that don't just take it for what it's worth. You have to really be thinking through all of the outcomes, especially on the first right, because that gets used so often in generic terms that you need to be thinking on behalf of your buyer or the seller when a first right comes over. Other than that, because this is one example of, there's 4 different pieces to this of a first right that would be different for any first right that you're doing at any given time. So that's it.
No, it's great feedback. So escalation clauses, which are more relevant than ever. So the definition is escalator, real estate contract, sometimes called an escalator, lets a home buyer say, I will pay X price for this home, but if the seller receives another offer that's higher than mine, I will be willing to increase my offer to Y price. In theory, an escalation clause is fairly simple. In practice, there's a lot of details involved. Okay, so let's talk about escalation clauses. First thing about, so we'll talk about it from the buyer's perspective. First thing about an escalation clause is we have a tendency in this market to be so, we get ourselves so riled up because it's like, oh my God, there's going to be 27 offers on this property, and we need to get our escalation clause in place. And how much are you willing to pay for this house? And are you willing to pay 10,000 over, 20,000 over? What is it? Well, the first thing we need to determine is there another offer on the property? Because I've gotten escalation clauses literally on my last 2 listings prior to there being another offer. Now that's not smart, because you're basically demonstrating what the seller will pay, or excuse me, what the buyer will pay, and that doesn't make any sense to me, from the standpoint of what the, unless you don't want to show your cards unless you have. So that's first and foremost. Now, many times there are. So the second thing is that if you're going to put an escalator out there, does your client have the ability to perform on that escalator? Because a lot of times people, will get a pre-approval letter. It'll be for the purchase price or maybe a little more, and they want to escalate to 30 or 40 or 50,000 more than that. Well, you need to make sure that you've gone back to the lender and said, hey, especially with first-time home buyers, it happened so fast. They're right in the middle of it. They're
You can't do that.
Somebody, hang on just a second. Can everybody mute themselves?
Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. So you want to make sure that in the cases where you're going up substantially, that they have the ability to actually perform on that. And the other thing is too, and we're going to talk about this a lot more as the session goes on here, but from the buyer and the seller standpoint for best practices and multiple offers, so there's a little bit of convoluted nature or cross on that. But the other thing is that you have to recognize that when you're writing an escalation clause, you're not necessarily writing, to that number. And the other party isn't necessarily writing to that number, in the sense that whatever the purchase agreement says, that's the number you're working off. Some people think that you're working off the escalated number from the standpoint of the seller. You're not working off the escalated number. You're working on whatever the purchase agreement dictates. So you have to have a bona fide offer in writing, not an escalated offer, because the escalated offer is an option under the premise that a certain other event has occurred. And until that certain other event has occurred and been bona fide, which manifests itself in the action of the other party actually writing that offer, and then going above it, then it's a problem. Gina Stearns has something there. Carol, it says raised hand.
Hi.
Couple of questions in the chat.
Okay, let's go. Let's hear it.
Okay. Is it, in your opinion, is it correct to explain to your buyers that the seller, just like you were referring, that you're disclosing your hand that you're holding? I always tell them, and I've been questioning recently, I don't know why, whether this is correct to tell them, the risk is the seller can just choose to ignore the escalation clause entirely and just counter with the number that they've revealed they'll pay.
Great question, and we're getting to that, but yes. So I 100% agree with that. And if I'm the seller, if I'm representing the seller, I never entertain an escalation clause, ever. And here's why. Why would I? I have all the information I need to have, right? I can counter anything I want to that. That escalation clause is not a mandate. So it's a term. So this is the analogy I always use when we talk about it with people. If I send over a contract and I say the price is $250,000 and the closing date is going to be April 1st, and the seller's not comfortable with $250,000 and not comfortable with April 1st, do they have to acquiesce to that position? And of course the answer is no, right? Well, similarly, they don't have to acquiesce to the escalation clause. That's a unilateral contract that's been sent over. Until it's been executed, the seller has no obligation to participate in that. Now, do I call up every buyer's agent and say, hey, you can shove your escalation clause, I'm not looking at, no, of course we don't do that. But what I go back and say is I say, listen, the seller is looking at highest and best offers, and we would like your highest and best offer. If that's your number, that where your number escalates, then we'll be happy to entertain that. Or if it's a different number, we'll be happy to entertain that. But we're not working with escalation clauses. And here's one of the fundamental reasons why I don't like to work with them. First of all, it just makes a contract more convoluted, right? It's another piece of information that can be disputed. Oh, well, it wasn't really exactly the same offer. Or, well, you know, that offer isn't the same because they didn't put the same amount of money down and their deal's FHA. And, oh, by the way, they have an inspection. And I know they have all the boxes that are checked and what have you. But I'm here to tell you, it makes the contract more convoluted. And having to have unwind these for periods of time, I will tell you, it gets very complicated and gets very contentious. So it just adds so if I'm the seller, I'm not participating. I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to allow behaviorally for the process to unfold. I'm going to have a conversation with the buyer's agents and say, listen, we're happy to work with your offer, but I need you to know we're asking for highest and best. These are the terms that the seller would entertain. This closing date, no inspection is better, blah, blah, blah. So Pete's got a comment, I think.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, Pete.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear, brother.
So what we realize too with escalation clauses is it's sometimes best not to tell them that you're not taking escalation clauses until they give you an escalation clause.
Oh,
then
100%.
Because then you in essence know what they'll pay, and then you go back to them and say, we're not taking any escalation clauses. Because the fact of the matter is, I don't want $500 or $1,000 more than the next offer when some people will spend 3, 4, 5% more than another person for the same house. So that's just my comment.
No, I'm really glad you made that clarification. That is so important. Thank you for that. And if I miscommunicated that, I apologize. That is a great point. We're not talking about escalation clauses until to the other buyer's agent until we receive them. 100%. Because you want to see that number, to Pete's point. You want to see that if the list price is $225 and they write $230 and then they're going to escalate to $250, we want to see that. We want to see that number because it's in the seller's best interest to see that number, because theoretically we could counter, which I think if things haven't changed, that's been Pete's position, is many instances will counter the escalation number in the event that he doesn't have a number that high.
And Tom, I would say on the buy side, maybe you convince your buyer that it may not be in their best interest to give an escalation clause, because they very well may be a savvy agent and may just say no escalation clauses, and now you've kind of given up that number. But in these environments, we all know the buyers really want these houses. So
no, I think
it's a tough conversation.
Yeah, but I think your comments are really, really good and really, really cerebral, because that's so true. The other thing about it, we've got a couple other comments, which we're going to get. I'll make this comment, and it relates to, because it kind of jogs a thought based on Pete's conversation that he's just brought up. The other thing about it is many, many, many times you'll have 6 or 7 escalation clauses, and they'll all start at, the purchase price, or maybe $5,000 over the purchase price. And all they are is, they just piggyback on one another. And so many times agents are like, well, I've got $240, I'm good. I'm going to get, it was listed at $225. I'm at $240 on this escalation clause. The other guy's going to pay me $241 because he escalates to $250 or whatever. Not the case. I mean, if the offer is not bona fide in writing, contractually presented in that capacity within that contract, you have not de facto can take to go to that escalated number. It has to be in writing. And more importantly, that ultimately has to be signed. So good point. How about the comments? Looks like at least
Stacy said, I've heard of escalation clauses being submitted lately with no maximum amount. Has anyone else experienced that? Which seems crazy to me.
I have not. Any thoughts? I'd love to hear somebody comment on that one.
Anybody raise your hand if you want.
This is Jay. One of the things that I've done on escalation clauses, which has worked each time, is I always write back in the counter that the seller will, or the buyer will pay the difference between offer price and appraised price if there's any difference. That throws off about half of the agents because they don't understand that. But if you're going to actually take an escalation clause, appraisal should have nothing to do with it, and the buyer should have cash to cover that difference.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jay. We're going to talk about that in multiple offers, but thanks for sharing, because that's a really, really important point and a great point. So any other thoughts on that, on escalation clauses?
This is Kristen. One of the things that I've been doing lately, because I've got a lot of first-time home buyers that are in that very precarious stage or a price point of 200 and under, I explain to them that escalation clauses are just not the best way to go. I tell them to think about what price they would be content buying the house at and not feeling that they overpaid, but also at what price would you feel okay losing the house and not wondering if you didn't go high enough. And that's worked for us to not have to do an escalation clause, and I've won a few houses because of that.
I think that was so well said. I can't even tell you. I mean, that was so well articulated. Probably in a more of a stumbling manner, I say exactly the same thing. Probably not articulated as well as you just did. I thought that was brilliantly said, and I concur with you 1,000%.
Thank you.
So Tom, I'd like to add to a purchase agreement that we recently won over. So it was both. It was an escalation clause and a multiple offer. There were 12 offers. They actually were not looking at VA offers. They didn't want VA, and our client was a VA. We went in at, it was 169,000. We went in at 178, escalated to 190, but with the caveat that they would guarantee 7,500 over whatever the appraised price came in. So there was a guarantee, no matter what, of 7,500 up to the amount that they accepted the purchase agreement for, the offer.
So one small clarification on this, Carol, because that's brilliant. I think Jay's also engaging in that process, and we're going to talk about that. I think it's really important. Was it over the appraised price or over any shortfall?
No, it was over the appraised price. So
if it appraised it $5,000 over what the purchase price was,
yep, up to the 190.
Okay.
Because we had a VA person that wasn't dealing with putting anything down, but they did have money coming out of their home that they could use if they needed to. So they leveraged that.
Fantastic.
They still got their VA, but they leveraged the fact that they had money to play with, and they guaranteed the seller. There wasn't this nebulous, like, okay, we'll pay the difference with no particular numbers involved. The seller knew that no matter what, the price that he put out on the market, he was going to get $7,500 more than that or more. So
great.
And the agent said that over the 12 offers, that was what he actually said to me. That was what the reason why the sellers made this decision. Great
real world practice of what works. I love it.
Plus they said they would pay up to $2,000 in VA, anything that VA called on the appraisal.
Repairs. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that in multiple offers, best practices. But yeah, that's also really, really creative strategy. So, okay, I think we're pretty. Does anybody have anything else on escalation clauses specifically?
Not seeing any questions coming up here.
Good. So we're going to go in on, and there's a little redundancy here, so I apologize, but I think that there's a few things that obviously go outside the scope of escalation clauses and first right of refusals within the multiple offers category. And I had another category too, but I just think in order to do this justice, we just kind of have to. Yeah.
Tom, Peter Manhart's raising his hand.
Okay, Pete. What do you got, buddy?
Yeah, that was from before. Sorry, but I will say that I just tell my clients to ignore the list price, and that list prices are just something that's dreamt up between a seller and a realtor. So homes can be underpriced almost as much as they can be overpriced. So you just have to know the market. I mean, you have to show them comps and say, hey, look at this. I mean, this is a great deal. You know, what is it worth to you? So
Yeah.
that's all I have to say.
No, that's another great point, is that, you know, markets are set by buyers, not by sellers. You know, you can't sell a house without a buyer. So markets are ultimately determined by buyers. We always say, thanks for bringing that up, Pete, because I should have said that. Here's what we say about a marketplace when it comes to buyers and sellers. Buyers set the price and sellers have veto power. Markets are made by buyers. And that's true when things are bad and prices are super low. And that's true when things are great and prices are going 20% over the asking price. But that's a really great point, is that regardless of which side it's on, you just need to know that markets are made by buyers, not by sellers. Okay, so multiple offers, how to win the buy side, how to manage on the sell side. Here we go. So we're going to start with the buy side. Okay, so the buyers, name of the game is knowing the hot buttons, right? So first thing I try to do when I've got a buyer and I know there's going to be a multiple offer situation or it's a very sought after property, is I try to call the listing agent, and I try to, if I don't know them, I try to develop some level of rapport with them. So I try to say, hey, you know, this is Tom Simmons, blah, blah, blah. See, you got this great house. My clients have interest. Can you tell me a little bit about the sellers and what they're trying to accomplish? We'd like to write you the strongest offer we possibly can. So the first thing I do is try to develop some rapport. A lot of times you'll know who they are. Say, gosh, my buyers are great people. They really want to get, I'll tell them a little bit about the buyer. So maybe it sticks in their head. Also, it's important to, you know, and I say kind of tongue in cheek, sure, write the letter, right? Everybody writes the heartstring letter. Some people are like, yeah, you get 7 letters, who cares? You know, it doesn't matter. But it never hurts. Nobody, if it's a nicely written letter, nobody says, I didn't give them the house because they wrote a letter, you know, but I have seen people win because of that. Is it a little overdone now? I think it probably is, but I don't know that it ever hurts. Maybe people can tell me that they think it hurts sometimes. I'm not aware of a circumstance where it hurt, and maybe doesn't always help, but I don't know that it hurts. As long as it's polite and it's well written and all that good stuff. Again, never write an escalation clause unless you know there are multiple offers. Always ask the listing agent if offers will be presented at a certain date and time or presented as received. And this is really important, right? Because if you don't know exactly when the offer is going to be presented, there's some strategic element to that. So some people wait until, you know, the final hour because they try to get the final count on how many of their offers there are. They try to kind of guess where the price could go. Is that realistic? Probably not. But you certainly don't want to wait if you just assume, like it's a Thursday night and the property goes on the market on Thursday, and you just assume they're not going to look at it till Sunday, right? Because that's what people are doing. Nobody looks at it till Sunday. Well, who knows? They might take your offer Friday. So I don't agree with waiting necessarily, unless I'm trying to clarify things, which I'll talk to you about from the seller's perspective. But I usually try to get them in as quick as I can, so long as I feel like we're writing a bona fide offer that has been well vetted from the standpoint of inspections and what have you. So that's one thing. Always know when they're presenting. Never assume anything about the process. Ask the listing agent if the seller would prefer a clean, highest and best offer over an escalated offer. Get the philosophy of the list agent. Do they have a distinct? There are people that hate escalation clauses and they present them in very bad light to their sellers. So you want to make sure that that you're not doing something that is going to be counterintuitive to best case scenario for your client. You don't want to put something out there from a standpoint of an escalation clause that the list agent is going to have a propensity to dismiss at hand to their seller. So that's important. Also, closing date. Is a closing date a big deal? We just had a situation last weekend with an agent, great agent in our office. I'm not going to tell them their name because some people don't like people to know their business, but gentleman was negotiating a buyer came in, was negotiating the offer, and it was really important to the seller that they have a lot of flexibility on the closing date because they were going to try to find something. And they were probably going to take less money to have the right closing date because they didn't want to be homeless and have to rent and what have you. My guess is that seller took less money to get the terms that they were wanting. So if your client can wait 60 days or 90 days and they can actually get the house for less money and that flexibility doesn't hurt them, you want to be cognizant of that. So again, that's the communication component. It's really important that you articulate to your client exactly what the listing agent has communicated to you from the standpoint of what the seller's wishes are. Will your buyer make up an appraisal shortfalls in cash? If it is VA or FHA, will the buyer agree to make repairs prior to closing up to a certain amount? Now, a couple things on this. You know as well as I do that sometimes people can't make up the shortfalls in cash. So we just need to make sure that's the case. Also, my comment on VA and FHA as I look at it right now is a little biased. Sometimes it's even a conventional loan that repairs get called out. So it's not, if a house, and that's become more and more common. So it's not only a VA or FHA. It is more prevalent, but it is more common for conventional loans to also get called out lately. So the other problem with making repairs is a couple things. You can have some sunk cost. What happens if the buyer's financing falls through and they've agreed to do this and they pay a vendor to do something? That's A. B is, what if they damage the property in some way, shape, or form? So you've got to make sure that you have an agreement in writing that states that they've got some sort of liability insurance or the vendor has some sort of liability insurance to ensure that they're not going to have a problem as it relates to that. So there's some nuance there in how you're going to utilize that strategy to get the best result. So, okay, next slide, I think. Oh, does anybody have any thoughts on that? Excuse me. Anybody, anything in the chat? Leslie, you have any comments on that?
No, but Jennifer Napolitano, I always mess it up. She said she suspected that she lost a house because of racism once. My buyers were foreign, and something the listing agent said tipped me off by their letter. Okay.
So there can be circumstances maybe where the letter can serve to your detriment. I guess, I don't know, I'll audible here a bit. Maybe this is a little bit of a rant. I mean, I guess I don't know how you can anticipate that somebody's going to be a racist. That's kind of disgusting. So I don't know, in the end of the day that you can anticipate that if you're representing a client that's, maybe doesn't have Smith as their last name or whatever. I think that's disgusting. So I guess I would never even think that way, but I suppose it's possible, but I don't, I guess that's something that you'd have to think through with your client if that presented itself. I guess that saddens me so much. I can't even kind of think that way, but that's the way it is out there, I suppose, at times. So, okay. Any other thoughts?
Hold on. A couple of people have their hands raised. So let's see. Sorry. Pete, I think you've got yours raised. If you wanted to chime in, feel free to unmute.
I just have to unraise it.
Sorry. I was just kind of popping through. Yep. Anybody else?
Yeah, I had a question, Tanya.
Yeah, hi, Tanya.
Hi, how are you? When they agree to pay the difference if the appraisal price does not meet their purchase price, should you get some kind of verification in writing that the buyer can come up with that cash?
That is a wonderful, wonderful thought. Yes. So I usually say, hey, so what I do is I ask the lender. So we're gonna talk about this on the seller side, but thanks for the question. So okay. I call the lender and I say, hey, and some lenders will say, hey, I can't speak to their exact cash position because that violates some tenant, from the standpoint of confidentiality. So then I'll say to the buyer's agent, I'll say, listen, this is very similar to a cash offer. I need proof of funds that they have enough cash to close on the property, pay the closing costs, and cover the difference. I need to see that cash in a bank account. Now, does that ensure that they're going to have the money to close? No, because they could go buy a car tomorrow, they could do whatever. That's why cash, and that's another conversation for a different day, but that's why people always say, oh, cash is gold. Well, I could have $100,000 in my account one day and it could be zero the next. So cash is not gold. Cash is only gold if they put the entire amount in the escrow account. So if somebody buy an house for $250,000 and the earnest deposit is $250,000, then you really have cash. But if you don't, then you don't. So I think, we kind of get enamored because nobody really has cash, or a lot of people don't have cash. So we get enamored with this idea, oh, it's a cash deal. They gave me a pre-approval letter. They've got $1 million in their 401k. Well, can they access it? Is it going to be there tomorrow? What happens if the market goes down 10%? They don't have a job, so they can't get financing even for $100,000. I mean, all these things are relevant. So I'll get off that rant. But any other thoughts, Carol or Leslie, specifically on this? Okay. That's no, because she went to the next slide. Okay. Buyers continue. Okay, inspections, very tricky. If the property's been pre-inspected, never assume the seller has made those repairs. So a lot of people get a pre-inspection, right? And they see the summary and it says, oh, cracked sidewalk, oh this, oh that. Oh, well, of course they're going to do that. Well, no, not necessarily. So you need to make sure that you have in writing that they're going to do that. So if the seller commits to make certain repairs, what I do is I highlight those repairs on the inspection summary, and I put an addendum together that says specifically that the items that have been identified will be repaired in the following manner. And then I go on to say not only what those items are, but in the manner in which they're going to be repaired. Because sometimes it'll say something like, inspector says licensed contractor should evaluate and make sure, and instead of saying we'll repair or replace. So that's a big problem. So I have that a lot where they say, oh my God, well, it said that the HVAC company would come out and look at it. And then I just, and they have to evaluate it. And that's what it said in the summary on the pre-inspection. And I said, yeah. And then they said, well, and then they came out and evaluated it and it's bad and they're not going to replace it. I said, yeah, because they're not obligated to. So you have to make sure that you're very, very careful in the way in the terminology you use. The other thing that's important is that you really look at who the inspector is that does the pre-inspection. Not all inspectors are created equal, just not like all realtors are. You've got to really do a deep dive. If you've got one of our people that we use, consistently, there's many of them in our organization that are affiliated in some way or another. There's others that are very good. I'm not going to call out specific inspectors right now because I don't know that it's appropriate, but we all know who they are. We use a lot of them. And there's different ones that other people use that are great too. But you need to make sure that the inspector, that you vetted the inspector. You need to frankly make sure that it's not somebody's cousin that just got their license, for the purposes of doing, or not, they aren't licensed, but ASHI recognized or approved or whatever. You need to be very, very special or very specific in making sure that the inspector that you use is good. Okay. Make sure your buyer can actually fulfill their commitment. So on the flip side, we got to make sure that the buyer doesn't go in and say, I'll do 190 and I'll do, and we'll cover the difference in cash. And well, maybe they're not money people. Maybe they don't have the 7,500 that Carol's people had. They may not even have the money, but in the haste, you know how quickly these things go down there in a matter of minutes, people are making decisions about these houses. So you just need to you need to slow the roll and think about things from the standpoint of what's going to work for them and what can they afford. And just because they have the cash, is that their last $500? Is that really prudent for them to put their last $500 in this house? Ultimately, it's their decision to make, but we do have a responsibility to counsel people not to set themselves up for failure. Ultimately, it's their decision, but we do need to kind of put the roadmap out there. And I personally am going to push pretty hard. I'm not going to make the decision, but if I have a first-time home buyer buying a $200,000 house that had an $8,000 cushion, and that's what they were going to have in their savings account, and they're going to have to put that $8,000 in the deal to get it, and they are literally not going to have a penny after that, I'm going to have a problem with that. Now, if they ultimately decide to do it, totally their prerogative. But I am going to communicate to them that I don't know that that's necessarily the best decision based on the totality of the situation. And it's not my decision to make, and it's not your decision to make, but it is appropriate for us to at least present the argument, because we have an obligation to serve these people. And we can't just to be on to the next deal, we can't just say, yeah, do it. That's not the type of people we are. So we have to have ethics and integrity in this process. It's worth losing a sale to always do the right thing. It's always good business to do the right thing, and you will be rewarded in the long term by doing the right thing. I believe that. So, okay. Communicate as frequently as possible with the listing agent, as sometimes things can change by the moment in multiple listing situations. So I know when there's like 10 offers, the last thing the listing agent wants to do is hear from you again in your annoying text or whatever. But the reality is that you want to know kind of in real time. And if you have rapport with that agent, sometimes they'll give you information that is going to behoove your buyer. Maybe they'll say, God, we just got a really good one came in, but it doesn't have a very good closing date. They're really big on the closing date, or it doesn't, you know, it's asking for an inspection, but it's super high. You never know what somebody will tell you. And it's not illegal to ask. I mean, if they're dumb enough to tell you, I ask, because it's not, I don't think it lacks integrity or ethics to ask the question. If they provide the answer, they provide the answer. I mean, that's just the way it is, and that's smart business, and it's good for, I don't think there's any problem with asking a question. Now, if you ask, hey, what are the other offers, you can look very amateurish, and that can turn somebody off. But if you have a rapport with somebody and they're willing to offer a little bit more information, and maybe that's their seller has given them that latitude to do that, and maybe it's in their seller's best interest because they're going to get the offer and the terms that they want, there's nothing illegal or inappropriate about that. So I would share that with you. Okay. Any thoughts and questions on that? Okay. Sellers, the name of the game is limiting risk. So never accept an offer until you've spoken to the lender about the buyer's pre-approval. The inflection in the lender's voice will tell you everything you need to know. How many of you have ever called that lender and normally you get, they're golden, 100%. Wonderful people. I love them. I can't wait to write this loan for them. So, and how many of you have called and they say, pause, well, you're screwed. They're not going to close. I mean, if you hear well and a big pause, you're at 50% best case scenario. So I go back and I just tell my seller, I said, listen, I didn't get a good feel from the lender. I may be wrong. They said they're working on it. It's possible, but that's not a good start. I mean, my experience has told me that if you get a pretty shaky response from the lender, unless they have a reputation for being extremely conservative, that's a bad start. Now I've had some lenders that are careful about what they say because they don't want to get themselves in trouble, and I kind of know who they are. They're the exception, not the rule. But you want to be really careful. If you hear their job, you know, they got to get a new job, you know, that's not a good start. So I would just say that. And pre-inspections are nearly always the right move in today's environment. So 4 or 5 years ago, I used to fight with Aubrey Haas because she told me everything should be in pre-inspect. I said, that was the dumbest idea I've ever heard, Aubrey. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're doing. You're crazy. Well, once again, Aubrey was right and I was wrong. And she was 100% right. She was ahead of the curve, like she is on a lot of things from a marketing standpoint and a practice standpoint. And I came around kicking and screaming and had to eat a lot of crow. But I think it makes a lot of sense because it allows the seller to mitigate risk. And if you can't get the seller to pay for it, it's one of the ways we can add value. As long as you're getting a 6% or plus listing, I think it's $350 or $385 or whoever you use, well spent. It's just it's a good investment in the listing. If you think about a $300,000 house or 275, whatever our average is, pretty much in there. You know, you're talking out of 12,000 bucks, you're talking 400 is not, you know, not a big number relatively speaking, and it can afford you a lot better outcome as opposed to putting the house back on the market once the inspection goes south. So always choose a respected inspector for pre-inspection. So Dawn says she disagrees on the pre-inspection and she's getting a lot of offers with no inspections right now. Okay, so let's have Don chime in. I want to hear the dissent. You can't just
I've
throw
never
it
really
out
been a
there,
fan.
Don. You gotta back it up.
I've never really been a fan of pre-inspections myself because I feel like whatever my sellers decide they're going to fix is not going to be the same things that a buyer wants to fix, and now we have disclosure issues. But in the market that we're in right now, I would say probably 75% of the time I get offers without inspections.
Okay. So fair thought. I get it. It's a fair thought. My counter argument to that would be this, and I don't think there's a right answer. There's the right answer for you. Just because you've had a pre-inspect and you've demonstrated what those issues are does not mean that you have to fix them. So
I understand that, but if I have
an
an offer with no inspection, then I've got no disclosure issues and my seller didn't have to fix anything.
Well, that's true, but what about the 25% of the time where you have an offer and you have to have an inspection, in order, because that's the highest offer and you choose to go that route, and then ultimately, so the question would be, the investment is nominal. Okay, so it's $300 to $400. So I think we could all agree that the investment is nominal. So the argument would be that you think that there's greater issues with the disclosure of certain items, not everything, but and ultimately that would be the difference maker. I'll just give you a for example, and this happened. I had a $760,000 house. I had it pre-inspected. We did absolutely nothing, not one repair. The repairs totaled $65,000. We got $760,000 on the 775. It closed Memorial Park, and we had it all out there in front in the open. And we had 2 offers, and both knew exactly what it was, and both knew that the seller wasn't going to do any repairs. And that transparency, I think, saved us, because I would almost guarantee you that had we gone in the inspection process, they would have asked for tens of thousands of dollars. So I would just say that not all one size fits all, but it's good to have differing opinions. I think on certain circumstances, it's not wise to do it. I can tell you in certain circumstances, it served me well. I will tell you, Dawn Grimshaw is a pretty damn good realtor. So I would take her thoughts with a lot of mustard, because she's good at what she does. So I love it. We're going to duke it out. We might get in the ring on that one later, Dawn.
All right, I welcome it.
Yeah.
And I would say, hey, Tom, I would say that there's too good of an argument on both sides, and that the seller really just has to be, let the seller decide. You know what I mean? Jen and I don't suggest them, but we completely understand why Aubrey does. And so we just put it out there for our sellers and let them decide.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. But don't you think this is a great, healthy dialogue, so you can make considerable thoughts to each? I mean, because there is merit to both. I think
right. And I do offer them to my seller. I mean, I tell my seller, some agents do pre-inspections. This is why they do them. This is why I don't recommend them, but I always give them the option. So I don't want to make it sound like I don't give them the option, but I don't recommend them.
No, it's fair. And I think this is really.
Kelly Michaelonis is asking a question on that same thing, Dawn. If they find something and then do they have to disclose?
If they find something in the inspection that's a disclosure issue, 100% they have to disclose it.
Right. Okay. That's her question.
Well, and I think, frankly, the truth be told, I mean, if you're going to do a pre-inspection and not demonstrate the findings, that's a little bit counterproductive, because the idea of it is, and you're right, you can't just say, well, I'll eat the $400. Now, if there's items on there that are material to the house, just to be clear, Don's point is well taken. If there are issues with the house that are material, adverse and material, then it doesn't matter whether it's in the seller property condition disclosure statement specifically. If you have actual knowledge as a realtor of a material defect, Latin or otherwise, you have to disclose it. So you have to go back to your seller, which this can cause problems, and I've had to deal with this before. You got to go back to your seller and say, hey, I have to tell them that if there's something weird, like it doesn't quite fit within the seller property condition disclosure, you could kind of circumvent it, but it is material and it's adverse. You have to disclose, by Nebraska statute, you have to disclose it as the buyer's agent, or excuse me, as the listing agent. So that's a fair point. Okay.
Kathy responded, in the lower hot price range, the seller might be out the inspection fee plus repairs they choose to do, which may total $1,500 or more, plus other repairs buyers may request. And the seller might not have had to pay anything in this market. So I think that's her.
Yeah, and that's fair. The counter argument to that would be that if you think about it though, here's the converse. You get down the road, the seller, by the way, you had 8 offers. Let's say you had 8 offers. What my strategy is I'm always trying to level the playing field is skewed all to the seller at the beginning, right? Well, if you don't have some nuance or I shouldn't say nuance, if you don't have some control as the process moves forward, then you're leveling the playing field and you're actually giving the buyer the control, because nobody wants to put a house back on the market for inspection related issues 3 weeks down the road.
Right.
It's just not a good look. I'm just saying.
Tom, what's your response to, and I'm on the leaning of doing pre-inspections, but what is your response when you actually do a pre-inspection, you decide on the sale, but that person also wants to do their own inspection for their own purposes?
Well, it happens all the
how do you
time.
as the seller respond?
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Normally, frankly, Carol, based on my experience, and I don't sell as much as some of these other people do now, so I can, but I do hear, helping people navigate these things. I do see quite a few of them. What I would tell you is that the reality is that more times than not, you're going to get somebody that will take the pre-inspection, especially if you're going to have multiple offers. So that would be the first argument. The second argument is that, ultimately, if you have to endure it, you have to endure it. And then essentially all you've lost is $350 or $385, because at the end of the day, now the argument is, oh, well, but the new inspector could find totally different things. And I used to make that argument. I find that argument less relevant today than it was at one time, but that would be the opposing argument. And I don't think one size fits all, and not one seller is the same as another. I'm not saying that point, and this is not just, for the purpose of being politically correct or straddling the fence. I'm telling you that I believe that pre-inspections more times than not are the appropriate strategic approach that a seller should take in this market today as it sits. That is my position. That said, not every single specific issue is created equal, and they all need to be evaluated independently. And that's not a caveat, that's just the truth. And there have been circumstances where I have not pre-inspected, because, for example, if a house is 1 or 2 years old and it's freaking perfect, why would you pre-inspect it? If there's going to be 1 or 2 little things, who cares? And I think it does matter how old. If you're dealing with a house that's 100 years old, that's probably different than a house that's 4 years old. So you need to, there are some differences in the age of the house, the ability of the buyer, the price point, all those things need to be held in consideration. But if we're kind of throwing the mud at the wall and looking at things from a general perspective, I'm an advocate of pre-inspections. Glenn Weaver says, what if you had a junker inspect it? Well, that's a great question. It just depends. It depends if the seller has any interest in making repairs. It depends on what the price point is, whether or not you think it even has the potential to go VA or FHA. All those things need to be consideration. On a house that's challenged from its physical characteristics, that's a really one-off evaluation that needs to be done. I don't think you can paint it with a brush. That's probably the one that's totally in the middle ground that needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So I'm big on making the earnest deposit non-refundable after the inspection if it doesn't close due to no fault of the seller. So if they want, and I usually try to get that earnest deposit up. I usually won't take one. If I have 7 offers, somebody's going to give, if I have 7 offers on a $200,000 house, I'll get somebody to give me $3 or $4 grand, and I'll get them to agree to make it non-refundable after inspection. And if they don't go through with it because they get, first of all, it's going to compel performance because it's going to make it harder for them to walk away. Second of all, I want my people to get their money and not have there be any dispute once it happens. And I want to be able to cancel and get back on the market. So that's important too. Okay. Do we have anything else on that, Leslie? Do we have another slide? Any thoughts on that, anybody? Okay. Try to get the buyer to make up appraisal shortfalls, which we've talked about. Confirm that they have the resources to do so, which we've talked about. If there's a potential for repairs from appraisal, try to negotiate that the buyer will pay up to a certain dollar amount. Now, I will tell you that if I'm the seller or the buyer, I'm probably inclined to have those repairs handled by the seller or the seller's contractor prior to closing because of liability reasons. So I would rather that the earnest deposit become non-refundable or money be put into an escrow account that will ultimately be paid to the seller, because I don't want necessarily a buyer or a buyer's vendor on the property, because if something goes wrong, we got a problem. What if the paint color is weird, like Leslie alluded to at a meeting I had with her today, or some weird kind of circumstance? You don't want to be holding the bag because you let a buyer's agent's vendor or a vendor of the buyer on site and they damage the property somehow. Or what if it catches fire or whatever? You don't want to create liability issues. So I generally would still have it be under the reprise of the listing agent, sellers, and then have the financial consideration addressed contractually in some capacity. Communicate with your seller. Do not assume that one term in the agreement is more important than the other. Really get into the motivation of the seller. Some people are introverted. Some people are very private. They don't necessarily communicate where they're at up front. And so it's important that you politely suggest to them, especially if you don't have a super close relationship with them, hey, what are we trying to accomplish here? Because remember, we work for people, not for houses. So at the end of the day, we're trying to achieve what that seller wants. The house is simply a widget. Doesn't matter. It's just a piece of property. It's just an asset. What isn't is the relationship we have with that seller to try to achieve their objectives. And those can manifest themselves in so many different ways. Never forget that we're only trying to achieve the objectives of the seller. The house is simply the conduit to do that, financially and behaviorally. So don't get caught up in, oh, well, it only makes sense for you to take the highest number. May not be the case. May not be the case. So I think if you have more than 4 offers, they should go in a spreadsheet, especially in COVID environment, and they should be communicated in person if possible. If they can't be, then it should be done on a Zoom, and you should screen share so they see everything, because sometimes they pick an offer and they don't have the apples to apples comparison. So that's a problem. Somebody else. Anyway, so really communicating each detail of the offer and articulating it to the seller is really, really important. And last, agents matter. Make sure you communicate to your client your level of comfort with the agent. Are they honest and sincere in their dealings? That can make a big difference down the road. So it's really important, and this is one of the reasons why it's important to be a really good agent and a really good steward of the process and be good to other agents, because remember, they're presenting your offer and for your buyer. And if you haven't been really a good steward or haven't been reasonable with people historically, or you've been kind of a hard-nosed person, then that's not a good thing. You know, it's important that you have rapport. And when you're looking at an offer, whether a seller that buyer's agent is reasonable is super important, because sometimes, you can get an agent that's going to be wholly unreasonable, and no matter what you do, the process is going to be difficult. I'm not saying that you don't take an offer from a buyer's agent that has a reputation for being a little tougher, but you at least want to put it into consideration, and I think it should be articulated to the seller, and I do. I absolutely do. I more do the positive, like, hey, this particular agent is a fantastic agent. You can take everything that they say as gold, and so there is a very small possibility we'll have problems working with this person. I say that because I think it's true. So anyway, that's all I got. Any thoughts? Carol, you're muted. You're muted, I think.
Okay, sorry. Any questions you have, you can put in the chat or raise your hand and we'll just call on you and unmute you.
Sorry, the PowerPoint got a little crazy there. My keyboard went nuts. Oh, look at, no, it's just.
Oh. Look at you.
I like it.
Don't whisper anything. It's going to come up. Well, that was great. Great, Tom. Okay, here we got something here. Wonderful information, Tom. Thank you. That's what somebody just said. Kelly, that baby cry, I think Kelly said, sorry, that was my buyer that lost the house.
Yeah, God, that's awesome. Well, that's going to be a lot of babies crying then.
Yeah, this was great information, Tom. And, you know, anybody that has, this will probably spark a lot of conversation and questions for people. And somebody just asked about if the slides will be available. So anything that you have, you can send. Leslie, you can send it out or send it to me, whichever is going to be the easiest to do. But thanks, Tom, so much.
You bet. No,
Hey,
I appreciate it, everybody.
Leslie.
Thank you so much for being on. Thanks so much,
Somebody's
everyone.
talking.
It's good to see everybody too. Everybody have a great day.
Yep.
Somebody was just
fun
talking.
to see everybody's smiling face.
Okay.
Okay, guys.
All right. Thanks, you guys.
All right. Did somebody have I heard my
Yeah.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Gina Stearns.
Hey, Gina.
Hi. So I wondered about the actual contractual law theory behind the multiple offer addendum. The fact that they can just flat out ignore it makes me think that at the theoretical level that somehow it's not intrinsic and tied to the contract, and maybe that's just the nerd in me, but I always like to understand what the principle is behind something. And it just confuses me that something that we present as part of a contract can just be completely set aside.
Well, remember, think about it in these terms, Gina. It's a fair question. Anything that is sent over from a purchaser is unilateral in nature.
Right.
Meaning that we can counter any terms in an agreement, right? So we can counter the price, counter the closing date, we can counter personal property, we can counter a term like an escalation clause. Those are not bilaterally agreed to. Somebody could come back as a seller and say, I'm not going to work with the Omaha area uniform purchase agreement. They could come back and say, you have to use this purchase agreement or I'm not going to do the deal. There is nothing that is gospel when it comes from one person to the other.
Right.
And it's gospel when it's bilateral by nature. So no matter what we send over, by virtue of what it is not binding on anybody until it's agreed to by the parties.
Right. And to your point about how much chaos they generate, I just went through a multiple offer situation where our multiple offer addendum got set aside and we got told we won the bid, and like nowhere in the counter did it address whether or not I had to literally ask her, well, did the and I was wondering what the verb is. I said, did the escalation clause trigger? And she says no. I'm like, so then in our counter I stated what the purchase price was and that the thing escalation was not triggered. Maybe overkill, but you are right about that.
It's not overkill. It's actually best practices. Anything that was presented, even if it's not executed. So for example, if you have an escalation clause that's sent over as a buyer and you're countering it as a seller, even though you're not executing, meaning your seller's not signing the escalation clause, in order to have belt and suspenders and be careful, you should always, anything that you're not participating in from the standpoint that was presented to the seller should be identified in your counter. So I always write, escalation clause will not be a part of this purchase agreement. Black and white.
And to make matters worse, she actually signed it and had the seller sign it. Signed the escalation clause and it wasn't being invoked. I'm like, oh boy, they're not kidding around. These things are messy.
That's malpractice. That's bad practice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Take care, you guys.
You
See you next
bet.
week.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.